January 1943. The cold grip of winter tightened across the North Atlantic. The sea, once a place of predictable calm, had turned into a battlefield. German U-boat U-99, commanded by the legendary Kapitänleutnant Otto Kretschmer, cruised beneath the icy waters, her steel hull groaning under the pressure of the deep. The crew moved silently through the dark corridors, their faces tense knowing what lay ahead. Above them, the ocean was alive with the hum of Allied destroyers, hunting with ruthless efficiency. Their radar could track the U-boats, their depth charges waiting to tear apart anything that dared venture too close to the surface. But Kretschmer had a plan. He knew that survival in these waters meant adapting, changing the game. The U-boat would dive deeper, deeper than ever before into the abyss that had been once thought impossible. The sound of depth charges was becoming a familiar, terrifying symphony in the Atlantic. As more Allied ships poured into the frigid waters, the Germans found themselves increasingly cornered. The tactical advantage that had once been theirs, silent, elusive, deadly, was fading. Yet it was the depth charges that would soon force the U-boat captains to rethink their strategy entirely. The standard tactics of the past, surface attacks followed by quick dives, were proving insufficient. The depth charges were more accurate, more powerful, and the Allied response more relentless. It was in this moment of crisis that a dangerous new tactic was born, diving too deep. But why did the U-boat captains take such a risk? Why did they start diving to depths that could crush their vessels, potentially sending them straight to the ocean floor? The answer lay in the brutal reality of the war at sea. The Allied depth charges, designed for the depth at which the U-boats traditionally operated, were becoming increasingly sophisticated. The explosions were more precise, their timing deadly. A close miss could rattle the hull, but a direct hit, destructive. The deeper the U-boat went, the further away they could get from these explosives. The deeper they dove, the less likely the depth charges would reach them. By late 1942, after months of relentless convoy battles, the German U-boat fleet was suffering heavy losses. U-boat commanders began to experiment with these extreme depths, testing the limits of their vessels. The depth was now more than just a tool for evasion, it was a lifeline. The pressure at these depths was enormous, but the potential for survival was even greater. If they could dive deep enough, they might just escape the deadly reach of the Allies' best weapons. The U-99's crew knew it. They could feel the immense strain on the hull as Kretschmer took them deeper than any of them had ever gone before. The creaking of the boat became almost unbearable, the walls of the vessel groaning as if the sea itself was trying to crush them. But they held, their metal skin resisting the crushing forces. And they survived. The deeper U-boats dived, the more isolated they became from the rest of the war. Communications were limited, their sonar useless in the depths where the pressure and the cold distorted everything. In the darkness they were blind. But in the silence they also became ghosts. The Allied destroyers, unable to detect them at these extreme depths, passed above with no idea that the U-boat was beneath them, lying in wait like a predator. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse, and for a time the Germans had the advantage. But this new tactic was not without its dangers. The U-boats were designed for surface operations and shallow dives, not the crushing pressures of extreme depths. The hulls, reinforced as they were still vulnerable to collapse under too much strain. U-boat captains like Kretschmer pushed their vessels to the limit, knowing that the gamble could end in disaster. If the pressure grew too intense, the hull would buckle, and the entire crew would be sent to the depths with no chance of survival. It was a game of survival, but it was also a game of chance. There was no guarantee they would survive the extreme depths they sought. The risks became more apparent in the following months. U-boat after U-boat was lost to the depths, victims of their own strategies. But even as the losses mounted, the tactic was refined. U-boat captains like the legendary Kretschmer learned to gauge the depth at which they could dive and survive. They learned to read the subtle changes in pressure, the groans of their ships, the sounds of the sea around them. It became an art, one that required perfect timing and instinct. If the U-boat captain misjudged, if they dove just a little too deep, the results could be catastrophic. But if they dove deep enough, they could slip away from the enemy, vanishing beneath the waves. As the war raged on, the Allied forces adapted to the U-boat threat. New technologies were developed to counter this extreme diving tactic. Sonar equipment was refined, and the depth charges were adjusted to target deeper waters. But even as the Allies honed their techniques, the German U-boat captains were still winning battles beneath the waves. The war was changing. The U-boat captains knew that the balance of power at sea would hinge on their ability to master this new tactic, the ability to dive deeper, to evade, to survive. They understood that only by doing so could they strike fear into the hearts of the Allied convoys and secure the resources that would determine the outcome of the war. But as the winter of 1943 dragged on, the question lingered: would the gamble of diving too deep ultimately destroy them? Was the cost of survival, an increasingly isolated, dangerous existence beneath the waves, worth the fleeting moments of victory? For Kretschmer and the other U-boat commanders, the answer seemed clear. As long as they lived, they would fight. As long as they had breath in their lungs, they would dive deeper. And as the pressure on their vessels increased, so did the pressure on the war itself. The stakes were higher than ever. The Allies were determined to rid the oceans of the U-boat menace once and for all. But for the U-boat captains, the war was far from over. The battle beneath the waves had only just begun. By the spring of 1943, the German U-boat fleet had evolved into something more than just a series of submarine attacks. It had become a desperate, high-stakes game of survival beneath the waves, where every decision, every turn of the wheel, could mean the difference between life and death. U-boat captains like Otto Kretschmer, who had mastered the art of diving into the crushing depths, found themselves caught in a new, terrifying phase of the war. The very tactics that had once given them the edge, deep dives into the abyss, slipping beneath the radar of Allied destroyers, were beginning to wear thin. The Allies were adapting faster than ever, and new technologies were emerging that would challenge everything the German submariners had come to rely on. The Allied response to the growing U-boat threat was relentless. By mid-1943, radar and sonar systems had advanced to the point where they could detect U-boats at greater depths, especially as they began to dive deeper and deeper in an attempt to escape depth charges. The Allies' warships, equipped with the latest sonar equipment, were able to track the submarines with alarming accuracy, even when they dove past their traditional operational depths. This gave rise to the concept of depth charge warfare, a deadly new form of combat that would push both the U-boats and their captains to their limits. One of the most significant innovations was the development of improved depth charge settings. These charges, originally designed to target U-boats at relatively shallow depths, were now being set to explode at much deeper levels, where the U-boats had taken refuge. The new charges, designed to detonate at various depths, could reach deeper water and cover a wider area, increasing the chances of a direct hit. The Germans had no choice but to counter these new weapons. Their submarines, once masters of stealth and silent killing, now found themselves facing an enemy with the technology to fight back. As U-boats dove deeper, they discovered a new set of challenges. The immense pressure at these depths pushed their hulls to the breaking point. The U-boat was a fragile beast, a machine built for stealth and precision, not for withstanding the crushing depths of the ocean. Every dive brought the crew closer to disaster. The U-boat's hull, reinforced with thick steel plates, groaned under the weight of the water pressing from all sides. The air inside the submarine grew thick with tension, the crew members nervously watching the pressure gauges as the depths increased. They had learned to dive deeper, but the consequences were ever more severe. A single mistake, a slight miscalculation, could send them crashing to the ocean floor. But it wasn't just the physical challenges that haunted the U-boat captains. The psychological toll of diving deeper took a heavy toll on the men inside the submarines. The isolation, the claustrophobia, the constant fear of being detected by the Allies, it all began to wear on the morale of the crews. Many U-boat commanders, once confident in their ability to outwit and outlast their enemies, now found themselves questioning their tactics. As the pressure of the war mounted, their nerves frayed. Some captains, like Kretschmer, remained resolute, their legendary calm in the face of danger an inspiration to their men. But even the bravest U-boat captains couldn't escape the toll the war was taking on them. Despite these challenges, the Germans were determined to continue the fight. The idea of diving deeper was no longer just a tactic, it was a matter of survival. Kretschmer, who had once been heralded as the most successful U-boat commander of the war, found himself grappling with a new reality. The Allies were closing in. As more and more U-boats fell victim to improved Allied tactics, Kretschmer realized that the key to survival lay not in evading depth charges, but in outsmarting the enemy altogether. He began to change his approach, using a combination of speed, stealth, and misdirection to confuse the enemy. In one particular engagement, Kretschmer used his knowledge of the sea to set a trap for an Allied convoy. As his U-99 approached, he dived to a depth so extreme that even the most advanced sonar equipment would be ineffective. The convoy, unaware of his presence, sailed right into his trap. Kretschmer launched his attack with deadly precision, sinking 2 ships before diving once again into the depths. The Allies, unable to detect him in time, were left scrambling in confusion. But even this success came at a cost. Kretschmer's crew was exhausted, their nerves frayed and their resources dwindling. The longer the war went on, the more desperate the situation became. Meanwhile, the Germans were working tirelessly to improve their submarines. The U-boat designs were constantly being updated, with reinforced hulls and improved engines. But, no matter how much the engineers pushed their designs, they couldn't overcome the fundamental problem of the depths. The deeper the U-boats went, the more dangerous the environment became. The high-pressure depths not only posed a risk to the submarines themselves, but also to the very men who piloted them. Many U-boat captains began to push their crews to new extremes, diving deeper and deeper in a bid to escape the growing threat from above. But each time they did, the cost of survival grew greater. At the same time, the Allies were not standing still. The Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy worked tirelessly to develop new tactics for countering the U-boat threat. One of the most significant advancements came in the form of radar, which allowed destroyers to track U-boats even as they dived to extreme depths. This new technology gave the Allies the ability to pinpoint the location of U-boats, making it far more difficult for them to hide. Depth charges, which had once been the weapon of choice for dealing with submerged U-boats, were now being refined to target the depths where the U-boat sought refuge. For the U-boat captains, the stakes were higher than ever. The war was becoming a race against time, a race to dive deeper, evade the Allies, and strike back. But with each new dive, the risks grew. The deeper they went, the more likely it was that the hulls would crack, the air supply would dwindle, or the pressure would simply crush them. Yet for the U-boat captains, there was no other choice. They had to push their vessels beyond their limits, even if it meant risking everything. As the war raged on, the U-boats became a symbol of the dangers of warfare beneath the waves. For every victory they achieved, there was a cost, a toll that could be measured in lives, in lost ships, in the constant strain of survival. The German U-boat captains had learned to dive deep, but they had also learned that the ocean was a harsh, unforgiving mistress. As the U-boat war dragged into 1944, the captains knew that their very survival depended on the next dive. It was a dangerous game, and only those with the will to survive would live to see the war's end. By the summer of 1944, the once legendary German U-boats had become shadows of their former selves. The Atlantic, once their domain, had turned into a graveyard for countless submarines. The tactics that had once given them an upper hand, diving deeper than the Allies could follow, lurking in the depths, were no longer enough. The U-boat captains, including the likes of Otto Kretschmer, found themselves caught in a war of attrition that was slowly strangling their ability to fight. The Allies had evolved, and the pressure to maintain their dominance beneath the waves had never been higher. In the heart of the Battle of the Atlantic, the Allies had made significant breakthroughs. While the U-boat captains relied on their knowledge of the ocean and their ability to dive deeper, the Allies had developed an increasingly sophisticated anti-submarine warfare (ASW) arsenal. Depth charges, once ineffective at extreme depths, had now been adapted with new designs. Their detonators were more reliable, and they could be set to explode at varying depths. Sonar systems, refined and perfected throughout 1943, allowed the Allies to track U-boats even as they dived to previously unthinkable depths. The sophisticated technology had caught up with the U-boat captains' best-laid plans. As Kretschmer and other U-boat commanders pushed their vessels to the limits, they found themselves running out of options. Diving deeper had been their answer. To evading Allied depth charges, But the deeper they went, the more perilous the journey became. It was not just the risk of being crushed by the immense pressure of the ocean that haunted them. It was the psychological toll. The longer the U-boat captains and their crews stayed submerged, the more isolated they became. The claustrophobia of the steel hulls, the lack of communication, the constant fear of detection, all these factors weighed heavily on the men. The ocean, once their ally, had become a silent adversary. It was in this environment that the Wolfpacks, the coordinated U-boat flotillas that had been so successful in earlier years, began to falter. The unity that had once been the U-boat fleet's strength was now a liability. The communications between U-boats were more difficult as they dived deeper, and their sonar was no longer effective at long ranges. They were losing the ability to work together, and as a result, their effectiveness as a force was diminishing. The U-boat commanders were beginning to realize that, even if they survived the depth charge attacks, the war was shifting in favor of the Allies, but the greatest blow to the U-boats came in the form of new Allied tactics. The hunter-killer groups, which had been developed as an answer to the U-boat menace, began to turn the tide. These groups, consisting of radar-equipped warships, destroyers, and specialized anti-submarine aircraft, relentlessly hunted the U-boats across the Atlantic. The U-boat captains, who had once prowled in the shadows of the deep, were now being pursued with a relentless efficiency that they could not outrun. No longer could the U-boats dive to extreme depths and hide from the enemy. The Allies were closing in, adapting faster than the Germans could counter. The U-boats that survived these attacks were often left crippled, their hulls damaged, their crews exhausted. The once proud fleet that had terrorized the Atlantic was now a shadow of its former self. The damage done to the U-boat force was devastating. By mid-1944, the German Navy had lost over 700 U-boats, almost half of its operational fleet. The toll was not just in ships lost, but in lives. Hundreds of U-boat crew members perished beneath the waves, victims of their own strategy. Their families, far away in Germany, would never know their fates, for the ocean was a cruel mistress that offered no answers. Yet, despite these staggering losses, the U-boat captains did not give up. In the face of overwhelming odds, they continued to fight. Kretschmer, who had been captured by the Allies in 1941, returned to command U-boats in 1944. His determination to fight, even as the odds stacked against him, was a testament to the resilience of the U-boat force. But for every victory, there were more defeats. Every new attack against the Allies came with higher costs, and the longer the war dragged on, the harder it became for the U-boats to keep pace with the rapidly advancing Allied technology and tactics. As the war entered its final stages in 1945, the U-boats had been pushed to their breaking point. Allied destroyers, now armed with powerful sonar, radar, and depth charges, patrolled the Atlantic with impunity. The once feared U-boat Wolfpacks were now reduced to scattered remnants, unable to regroup or strike with the same effectiveness. The Allies had turned the tide, and the ocean that had once belonged to the Germans was now their domain. The last days of the U-boat campaign were marked by desperate, isolated attacks. The German Navy had already shifted its focus to other fronts, but the U-boats kept coming. They launched attacks against convoys, against Allied shipping, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Some U-boats, like the U-234, attempted to make a final stand, but the writing was on the wall. The war was ending, and the U-boat had failed to secure its place in the final victory. In the aftermath of the war, the legacy of the U-boat campaign would be one of both tragedy and triumph. The U-boats had been the most fearsome weapon in the German arsenal, striking fear into the hearts of Allied sailors. They had changed the nature of naval warfare, proving that the sea could be a battleground just as deadly as any on land. But their tactics, especially the dangerous dive to extreme depths, had come at a great cost. The U-boat commanders had gambled with their lives, and the cost of that gamble had been high. The Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic was not just a victory of technology and tactics, but of human endurance. The U-boat campaign had claimed the lives of thousands, both German and Allied, and left scars that would never fully heal. But it was also a victory for the future of naval warfare. The lessons learned in the depths of the Atlantic would shape naval tactics for decades to come. As the war ended, the U-boats were retired. Their captains returned home, their tales of war forever etched into the annals of history. And so, as the war came to a close, the ocean that had once been the U-boat's hunting ground became their tomb. For the U-boat captains, the lesson was clear. The depths had been both their salvation and their undoing. The ocean had claimed them, and in doing so had changed the course of the war forever.